Twilight of the senatorial giants. So twilight meaning coming to an end. So when they're talking about the giants of the Senate, they're mostly referring to kind of a group of three big name senators called kind of the Old Guard. So the Old Guard is made up of these three senators who we talked about a number of times because they're kind of a big deal. Okay, we have Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. Okay, so they have a task in front of them. Okay, we are in crisis in the United States right now because California is wanting to enter as a free state. This freaks the South out. The South actually announced a meeting in Nashville to talk about possibly leaving the Union, so leaving the United States. So the Union is in crisis. So these three kind of big names in the Senate, really, this is kind of their last issue they try to tackle. Okay, Henry Clay, he was 73 when this was happening. He's known as the Great Compromiser. So he's the one who got the Missouri Compromise passed. Remember that back in the day when Missouri wanted to enter? So the Missouri Compromise, he's also the one who kind of diffused the South Carolina nullification crisis. That was Henry Clay as well. So he was working again towards a compromise during this crisis. Kind of along with him, not one of the big senators, but someone to note because he comes up quite a bit later on, is Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was the escaped slave. We're talking about Stephen Douglas. He's a senator from Illinois, and he's known as the Little Giant because he was only 5'4", but he sure did know how to make a speech. So Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay kind of worked together on this issue, so that's why I'm mentioning him. So Henry Clay, let's talk about then John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun had been vice president under Jackson. He's from the South, so definitely still representing the voice of the South at this time. He was 68, dying of tuberculosis, a member of this Old Guard as well. And he really championed the South. He was pleading for just leave slavery alone. We want to keep the Union intact. Can you just, protect the Southern rights for once? Can we just protect the fact that slavery exists down there? Can we just, lay off the South? We need to preserve the Union. And he actually ends up dying he ends up dying in 1850. So all of these three are kind of quite elderly, old for their time. The third of the Old Guard was Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was 68, and he was dying of liver failure, mostly because he killed his liver by drinking too much. But he was really the voice for concession, for compromise, for reason. He's like, hey, folks in the North, we have to compromise. We have to give the South some sort of concession. He even put forth the idea of, hey, maybe we should make a new Fugitive Slave Law as kind of a concession to the South, because he's like, we have to make a compromise here to save the Union. So he is famous for making a speech called the 7th of March speech. It was on the 7th of March of 1850. And in this, his speech was over 3 hours long, but about 100,000 copies of it were spread all throughout the country. And this speech really turned the tide of how the Northerners felt about giving a compromise or giving a concession to the South. Before this time, the North was really against any sort of compromise, but Daniel Webster, through the 7th of March speech, really kind of got the North to consider a compromise, to consider compromising with the South. Yeah, so the whole idea was compromise, concession, reason. Yep. So, kind of a funny side note of history, Daniel Webster, through giving this speech, like I said, really got the Northerners to think about a compromise that really helped kind of save the Union, prevented the North and the South from splitting right then and there. And the Northern bankers were so relieved that that Daniel Webster really allowed for this compromise that they ended up giving, there's one example of see, where is he from? A Washington banker who literally gave Webster $6,000 because he was so thankful he had saved the Union. Because remember, these northern bankers had loaned a lot of money to the southern plantation owners, and they were scared that if that Union were to split, they would lose all of that money. So the northern bankers were very, very, very happy with Daniel Webster for insisting that the North compromise. All right. But, you know, others didn't like Daniel Webster because they thought he was a traitor for even thinking about giving a concession to the South through this Fugitive Slave Law. Okay. Next section, deadlock and danger on Capitol Hill. Okay, so we just talked about the old guard. We talked about Webster, Calhoun, and Henry Clay. Now we're going to be kind of talking about the younger folk, or the folks who are called the Young Guard, and these are made up of politicians from the North, the foremost of which is Stewart, or I should say William H. Stewart. I said Stewart, there's no T. Anyway, Seward. His name is Seward, not Stewart. Anyway, he's a senator from New York, so William H. Seward, senator from New York, and he's really kind of the spokesperson politically for anti-slavery feeling in the North. And he was saying no concessions to the South. Daniel Webster was like, we have to give concessions to the South, we have to make a compromise. William Seward was like, no, we don't. In fact, we shouldn't make a compromise. He didn't make this a constitutional issue. He made this a moral issue. So he said, you know, this is not a constitutional issue, but a Christian issue. Okay, Christian legislators must obey God's moral law. So he's saying that this, you know, all Christian legislators ought to be stubbornly opposed to slavery because they need to answer to this quote-unquote higher law than the Constitution, God's law. Makes sense? So he's kind of going there with religion. So yes. So President Taylor, who is himself from Louisiana, seemed to be influenced by Seward's ideas. So we don't actually know, but at least he seemed to be influenced by this idea of no compromise, because President Taylor literally shot down every single compromise measure that was able to pass through Congress. So, you know, President Taylor was really ticked off at Texas, because like I talked about before, Texas had kind of claimed a chunk of New Mexico for itself, and President Taylor was so mad at Texas for doing this. He even threatened to march down himself to Santa Fe and force Texas to give up this chunk of New Mexico, kind of hearkening back to, remember, when Jackson was so mad at South Carolina for nullifying the tariff that Jackson had threatened to march down himself. So we see a little comparison there. Anyway, so let's keep going. Next section, breaking the Congressional Log Jam. Okay, so we're definitely at a crossroads here. Okay, what are we going to do with California? We have to find some sort of compromise, or do we? You know, Daniel Webster's like, we need a compromise. William Seward's all like, we can't compromise. This is like God's we're talking about here. So breaking that log jam. So the thing that really actually helps break this kind of the log jam is that, unfortunately, President Taylor dies suddenly of some sort of intestinal disorder. So President Taylor dies, and remember, President Taylor had kept vetoing all these compromise measures. So now that President Taylor is in the grave, Vice President Millard Fillmore becomes president. So Taylor and his non-compromising ways is replaced with President Millard Fillmore. And remember that one of the duties of the vice president is to kind of reside over the Senate. So Millard Fillmore had been in the Senate for, residing as the head for quite a while, and he had listened to, speeches for a compromise. So Millard Fillmore was actually very much for, okay, I think a compromise is a good thing. So Millard Fillmore actually signed this huge document called the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850, kind of a huge deal. Let's talk about what that was. Okay, so it allowed, let's see. Why do I have that? Anyway, so it allowed California to enter as a free state, like it wanted to do, and it allowed New Mexico and Utah to have popular sovereignty. So New Mexico and Utah got to decide for themselves if they were going to enter free or slave. Also, it ended the slave trade in D.C., not slavery itself, but the slave trade in D.C. was ended. But a much stricter Fugitive Slave Law came about because of this compromise, or as part of this compromise. So naturally, because it was a compromise, both people in the North and the South were upset about parts of it. But Henry Clay in the North, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Stephen Douglas really spoke out fervently in support for this compromise. So the North in general, accepted it as a way to save the Union. They didn't like the Fugitive Slave Law, but for the most part, they saw that it had to be a compromise. So the North accepted it in the long run. South, same sort of thing. In the South, there were people ardently opposed to this. They were known as fire eaters. And they were just kind of these fierce slavery folks that violently opposed the concessions of California entering as free and New Mexico and Utah getting to decide. So there's, in this, as an example, there's a South Carolina newspaper that had a quote that says, they hated the North as much as hell itself. So the South was quite upset about this. But, in the long run, the Unionists in the South, or those in the South that are very interested in saving the Union, kind of won over in the long haul. So after this compromise of 1850, people thought this was the end. They thought, hey, we solved slavery. So this kind of second era of good feelings started to come about. The talk of the South succeeding kind of was quieted down, and the peace-loving folks in the North and the South, that they finally, this boiling pot of slavery, that issue was settled. So after the Compromise of 1850, although it was posed by some in the North and some in the South, in the long haul, it really did just put the country at peace for a little bit. Okay. So next section is called Balancing the Compromise Scales. So this section kind of looks at it, who got the best deal? Who got the better deal in this compromise of 1850? Was it the North or the South? Well, really, quite clearly, the North got a much better deal out of the Compromise of 1850. And here's why. Okay, so California enters as a free state, then giving the majority in the Senate to the abolitionists, or to the free states. Also, New Mexico and Utah, why there was popular sovereignty, why they did get to decide for themselves if they were going to enter as free or slave. It was quite clear that both Utah and New Mexico would enter as free. So a part of the Compromise of 1850 as well, Texas had to give up the claim to New Mexico. It had kind of that issue was solved. So Texas got $10 million. In exchange, Texas had to relinquish that part of New Mexico they had been so fervently hanging on to. And really, $10 million in the long run wasn't a whole lot. Okay, but on the flip side, the South got their new Fugitive Slave Law. So let's talk about the Fugitive Slave Law. Another super important thing. So this was obviously the Fugitive Slave Law, this new Fugitive Slave Law, was a part of the Compromise of 1850, and a very important part. So a couple of things that it said, this law dictated, it gave high penalties for anyone who helped escape slaves, and it made law enforcement retrieve runaways. So, you know, free slaves, or slaves that had escaped, they weren't given a jury trial. They had no right to testify for themselves. And the federal commissioners, who kind of more or less tried these runaway slaves, although a trial wasn't the appropriate word, they were given $5 in compensation if they declared the runaway to be free, but they were given $10 if they were to declare that their runaway was not free. So that was kind of iffy at best. What sort of justice is this? You know, it's almost like a bribe to make the commissioners declare that these runaways are indeed slaves. Excuse me. Okay, so the North really hated this new fugitive slave law. They called it the man-stealing law. And it really, shocked any moderates that were left in the North onto the abolitionist side or onto the anti-slavery side. Anyone in the North who was kind of left sitting on the fence about the issue of slavery was kind of shocked off the fence by this new fugitive slave law. For example, of how much the North was not a fan of this, in Boston, a runaway slave was caught. So a runaway slave was caught in Boston, and he had to be removed from the city under heavy guards. Okay, because more or less a whole bunch of people in Boston lined the street in protest against this runaway being forced back into slavery. So the Bostonians lined the streets in protest. They flew their flags upside down. Some buildings actually draped their buildings in black as a kind of a sign of protest. You know, the people in the North were not happy about this new fugitive slave law at all. Massachusetts, for example, actually made it a crime to enforce this slave law. Some states had passed something called personal liberty laws, and these personal liberty laws more or less said that federal officials couldn't use their state jails to house these runaway slaves. So they said, okay, this is a federal law, this fugitive slave law, this is a national law, so if you want to arrest these runaway slaves, you're not allowed to use our state jails. So they were, you can see they were ticked off. The North was not liking this. And really, so overall, this fugitive slave law, it was kind of a poor move on the South, on the South's behalf. Okay, because this fugitive slave law really didn't do the South many favors, okay, because what it did, the biggest effect of this was really awakening the North even more against slavery. And just kind of finishing this off, there's kind of an interesting point that was made at the end of this section. And the point was that the Compromise of 1850, we just got done talking about, won the war for the North. And that's an interesting statement because obviously this is before the Civil War even started. But here's the point they're trying to make, okay? So the Civil War, not the silverware, the Civil War started in the early 1860s. So this compromise prevented war for an additional 10 years. Okay, it was kind of a band-aid over this issue that allowed it to go on without war for another 10 years. But during these 10 years, the North really grew in population, the North grew in wealth, the North had more crops, the North built more railroads, the North had better ships, the North made more factories, and in the North, over these 10 years, from 1850 to when the Civil War started, 1861, it was really the chance for slavery to be put forth as a moral issue. That allowed that 10 years really kind of solidified the North's hatred of slavery. So that was kind of an interesting point to make. You could really think the Compromise of 1850, that compromise extending maybe the Civil War, kind of pushing the Civil War back 10 years into the future, really gave the North time to be strengthened before they fought. So, with that, I think this is enough for this video.